If you know me, then you'll know that I am infatuated with villains and antagonists. They hold key roles in their narratives not only as obstacles to their respective protagonists, but also as the ones to help push the narrative's central themes. What makes a truly amazing antagonist isn't just a character who opposes the protagonist, but the very meaning of the story itself. It is only through the selfishness of Yhwach that Bleach can tell us to embrace selflessness. It is only through the self-deprecating doubts of Leone that Sacred Stones can encourage us to push past our own anxieties. So whether it's the indomitable will of Edelgard, the fears that created En, or the unshakable riz that Aizen possesses, a well-written and executed antagonist can not only leave me in awe, but can make me rethink or possibly even alter my views on an entire narrative. So it's always kind of bugged me that I never really got these feelings about any villain in RWBY. And no, I'm not about to say until now, because while the subject of this video, the Curious Cat from Volume 9, is one of the series' better executed villains, he still doesn't quite reach my expectations for a great villain. But by my very nature, I cannot resist the urge to discuss this little furball. So sit back and enjoy as I ponder and question what makes a good villain into a great one, and subsequently ask if the Curious Cat is really RWBY's best villain. I find that the Curious Cat in particular has a lot more going for him than your typical RWBY villain because of how quickly he appears in the show. From episode 3 onwards, he has a consistent presence and we see the Curious Cat do a lot of things throughout those episodes. With each discussion he has with the group or any action that he takes, he's either gently nudging everyone towards the tree, or specifically and subtly manipulating RWBY's emotions in order to break her. Basically, he's just doing, typical evil villain stuff. But I obviously want to dig deeper than surface level stuff. By appearing so soon into the volume, we can get a lot more from him, and his consistent appearances allow for them to better develop him. And with how simple his basic personality is to grasp, he can be built off of much sooner. There isn't a lot of complexity they have to get out of the way. And this understanding is really important for the first thing he doesn't fall victim to: the why. I remember being initially impressed by the Curious Cat simply because he had a thought-out motive. I tend to find that many RWBY villains either don't have one or take way too long to give us one. It's almost like there's an assumption we already know or can infer everything about a character's motive. And while this can work in certain scenarios, having a discernible and believable motive is my preferred type of villain. I can infer why someone like Tyrion, a person who revels in chaos, might be working for Salem, but I can't really understand why Cinder does. We don't understand why she fights for Salem or what she gets out of the deal other than the maiden powers. Is it because Cinder only craves power and control to the point that she wants to have and control everything? We could kind of infer this, but the lack of confirmation means that the writers could easily decide that the real reason is because Salem is some motherly figure to Cinder, one who's been playing off of Cinder's attachments to get what she wants. If it's the second option, then it could tie really nicely into how Cinder grew up in an abusive household with an especially abusive mother, but once again, we don't know why she's doing it other than a few implications that don't go very deep. When there's more than a few points to build a motive from and we are this far in, knowing exactly why Cinder does the evil things she does would be greatly appreciated. Hell, my biggest gripe with Salem as a villain is that we know she wants the relics, that's part of her motivation, but we have no clue what she'll actually do with them. Some characters suggest that it's because she wants to die, but we don't actually get confirmation from Salem herself, and sure, we have a few possibilities, but we're 9 seasons in and the main villain still hasn't said why they're doing the evil thing. Just like with Cinder, I find that kind of annoying. It's also important to remember that having a motivation is different from having a believable motivation. If what your character is doing isn't all that believable to the audience, then it just isn't going to work. This is where someone like Ironwood failed as an antagonist. The build-up to that point was completely believable. We saw his anxieties and fears towards Salem push him to an extreme. But then Volume 9 has a completely changed personality and do things he simply would never regularly do. The Curious Cat, however, skips past this issue by directly stating his motivation of taking over RWBY's body so he can go to Remnant and figure out why his creators abandoned him, right to the audience. And this motivation works especially well because it ties into his insatiable curiosity, which not only has been shown to us extensively in the episodes prior to his villainous reveal, but is also in his name. He is the Curious Cat, and his curiosity demands he finds out why he was forced to remain in the Ever After. His motivations are believable based on what we have seen, and thus work quite nicely. Now, I think it's about time I address that line I said at the start. The idea that a great antagonist isn't just a character who opposes the protagonist, but the very meaning of the story as well. To explain what I'm talking about, we'll look at Pokemon Black and White, where one of the core messages is unity between two differing groups. It's through our clashing with N in the finale that the game teaches us that as long as people and Pokemon work together, then they can overcome anything, solve any truth, and reach any ideal. It is only through the unity between humans and Pokemon that there can be peace and happiness and all that jazz. So when Getsis, the true antagonist, reveals his plans to upset this unity and sit atop an army of Pokemon as a tyrannical dictator, he ends up opposing Black and White's themes, and, in my opinion, comes out a more interesting character for it. It's almost always a good idea to have your protagonist relate to your central themes as well as your main antagonist, because it can help you both explore and emphasize those themes. Now, obviously there are going to be exceptions. Not every story follows a set guideline, and no writer will write the same. In the case of RWBY, we have to acknowledge that the Curious Cat isn't the main antagonist of the series, but he is for Volume 9. So he only really needs to embody the ideas opposed to that specific volume's themes. So if we want to figure out if the Curious Cat is RWBY's best villain, we'll need to know what the main theme of RWBY Volume 9 is. And lucky for us, one of the writers, Eddie Rivas, has stated on Twitter that Volumes 7, 8, and 9 were built around the ideas of failure and finding yourself. And for the purposes of my current analysis, I'm going to ignore whether or not I think these ideas were properly explored in the ways the writers intended or were well written, because that's not exactly what I'm choosing to focus on. Right now, I'm only interested in whether the Curious Cat manages to play his role effectively. From how I see it, RWBY has already faced failure in Volumes 7 and 8, making Volume 9 have a stronger focus on the finding yourself part of the theme. This means that RWBY has to face her failures and move past them in this volume. She needs to look beyond the past in order to find herself in the future. So the Curious Cat, as the main antagonist for this volume, has to be opposed to that central idea, or at least actively prevent her from reaching that point. And I do believe the Curious Cat has moments where he does indeed oppose these ideas. When walking with Team RWBY in the woods, he subtly, not so subtly, brings up how indomitable Salem appears to be, most likely in an attempt to depress RWBY. Clearly he seeks to remind the team of their failures, so that's at least one theme ticked off. But on a more notable note, God, I am a terrible writer. He prevents RWBY from having meaningful introspection not once, but twice. Remember when the herbalist literally forced RWBY into a situation where she has to confront her fears and failures so she can find out what she is? Or maybe you're thinking about RWBY's first conversation with the blacksmith, where said blacksmith was encouraging RWBY to once again think about her identity. Regardless, these are both promptly interrupted by the Curious Cat, so we can actually see him act as a literal barrier between RWBY and her personal growth. He is trapping her in a state of depression and preventing her from thinking outside of it. He is doing exactly what I wanted him to be doing. He is actively opposing the themes present in the story here. So why am I still hesitant to call him RWBY's best antagonist? He has a thought out and believable motive, he opposes the themes of the story, he even has decent enough screen time. And yet he still does not fully captivate my villain-loving heart. So who does?
Do you have any idea how hard it is to find a dust shop open this late?
Roman Torchwick. The very first antagonist RWBY ever had. Unless you count Henchman 1, but come on, it was Roman. Like the Curious Cat, Roman Torchwick is not the main antagonist of the series. Hell, at this point in the show, he hardly even qualifies as a main antagonist for his respective volumes. He was always just a seemingly low-level crook surrounded by people bigger than him. And yet, I still think he has been one of RWBY's best antagonists. And it all comes down to how he relates to one specific idea. Or should I say, one specific theme. You see, early RWBY wasn't especially complex. The writers were still finding their footing, and as such, heavily relied on basic themes like good is always good, heroes protect the weak, and you probably get the idea. But one of their more unique explorations of these basic themes was what it meant to be a huntsman/huntress, with the answer being a person who protects those who cannot protect themselves. This was great because it would encourage the characters to think about what it means to be fighting grim and crime as a huntsman. Now, Roman is obviously not a selfless individual. In fact, he's the exact opposite. He makes decisions based almost entirely on his own survival, and he has no problem exploiting those around him, especially those he believes are inferior to him. Minus Neo. She's the only person he shows any kind of respect for. This also supports the idea that a good antagonist will have a well thought out and believable motive, as it's very clear his motivations for doing crime is also he can get those precious dimes. He's a greedy individual who seeks power, influence, and, from what we see in his novel, the fame that comes from being an uncatchable criminal. On a side note, I'm not really going to be talking about Roman Holiday of this antagonist discussion. I'm only really going to talk about his character in the show itself, but if you want to hear my thoughts on the book, then, you know what to do. The point is, his own ideology is opposed to the very notion of a huntsman, making him a perfect fit for a primary antagonist in these earlier volumes. Even his absent semblance can be viewed as another case of him opposing the concepts of a huntsman, as we regularly see the semblanceless portrayed as weak and in need of protection. And here's Roman going toe-to-toe with anyone in his way, semblance or not. This is also what I'd consider the distinctive difference between Roman Torchwick and the Curious Cat, as Roman doesn't just oppose the narrative's themes, but is actively built to be an alternative exploration of those core huntsman ideals. Meanwhile, the Curious Cat, while actively preventing RWBY from achieving the themes of Volume 9, doesn't really interact with those themes further himself. The most I can see is him being unwilling to change his perspective on humans right before his death, but that ain't much. It's for that exact reason that I find myself being so hesitant to like the Curious Cat, and this is my own personal opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, but I feel that while the setup for the Curious Cat was done right enough, the payoff was far too weak to be worthy of the best RWBY villain title. He makes an effort to oppose the ideas the volumes presents, but fails to interact with those concepts any further in isolation. I will, however, commend him for his effort. For the most part, he manages to be a better antagonist than the majority of the other RWBY villains. He's certainly better than the true main villain Salem, because unlike her, he actually does things in the story. Unfortunately though, I just feel like the Curious Cat needed most of his screen time dedicated to the exploration of his views on the self-identity theme, instead of him just cock-blocking RWBY all the time. So, sorry Curious Cat, but in my personal opinion, the best RWBY villain title should go to Henchman 1! Give it up for Henchman 1, baby! Woo!